There we go. The mute switch. I do. Yeah. Anyway, I I think we're just about ready to start. It turns out we already had started. I was quickly trying to eat my ice cream because I'm going to have to talk. I won't be able to sit here and enjoy my ice cream. Then it suddenly occurred to me that 6 o'clock had come and gone, which meant we went live with our video feed. So thank you, Sherry, for your comment already about me enjoying my ice cream. Isn't that wonderful? I actually am slightly fearful of the whole concept of live streaming because you can't just sort of have a do-over, but we're giving it our first shot tonight. So thank you for being here with us. We hope you enjoy the ice cream, and even more than that, I hope you enjoy and maybe, I don't know if enjoy is the right word, although I certainly hope that happens as we hear this story tonight. I hope you're also challenged by it. Not that we all have to become what Paul Carlson became, but that we hear stories like this and something in our own faith grows. One quick Bible thing, then I'm going to tell you a story. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 24, Paul says one of the strangest things, I think, in the whole New Testament. He says that he is filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. I hope any one of us who knows the gospel, know what Jesus did, would be like genuinely puzzled by that statement. It's like, well, there is nothing lacking in what Christ did for us, so how can Paul fill up what's lacking? What's missing? I've spent a number of years thinking about that statement, and I think this is a story that answers that question, because the only thing lacking in Christ's afflictions is not its ability to save us, the joy it produces in us, the forgiveness we experience, the adoption to Christ's family. The only thing that's lacking is the world getting to hear and see people who love Jesus live it out. And that's the story I want to tell tonight. So I'm going to pray, and then Paul Carlson's story. Father, thank you for an evening when we can gather to think on the life of a man, his family, who loved you, who obeyed you, who filled up what was lacking by the way they lived out their faith with courage and conviction and devotion. So encourage us, be with all of our church family wherever we might be tonight. Thank you for the wonderful ice cream that we've already been enjoying. In Christ's name, amen. The word wasolo in Lingala means the end of the world. But to the people who lived there, they simply know it as the forgotten place. It's in the northern part of the Congo, which became Zaire, which became the Congo again. It looks much like that. Now, I'm going to have to be turning around a little bit. The reason it's called the forgotten place is it's virtually impassable. Even to travel a few miles in this area of the world is almost impossible. So if you were born there and grew up there, chances are you would never travel very far from home over your whole life. There's very few roads. The ones that do exist are incredibly difficult to get over. And yet, in these jungles live tens of thousands of people who need to hear about Jesus. Just so you can kind of see where it is. I mean, the irony of the place known as the end of the world is that if you looked at a map, a typical map, it actually looks like it's in the middle of the world. And yet at the beginning of the 1900s, up to when our story is going to take place in 1960, 64, thereabouts, this jungle area of the Congo was filled still with elephants and gorillas and hippos and massive snakes and all those kind of things that probably would give us horrific dreams. But this is the area of our story. Let's see if I can get to the next slide here. We've been having a couple technical difficulties, and it looks like they're going to continue. So Pastor Andrew's going to take over clicking buttons for me. So that's number 4, right, Andrew? So there's the Congo, and the place that we're going to be talking about is basically right at the top of that screen. Almost a stone throw from the next country over, which will become important in our story near the end, the Central African Republic. On the other side of the world, in a place called Culver City, California, a boy by the name of Paul Carlson was born on either March 31st or April 1st. Apparently, when he was born, his dad could see 3 clocks in the room at the same time, and they all had slightly different times, and it meant either he was born still in March 31st or in April 1st, depending on which clock they chose, and his parents didn't want an April Fool's baby, so Paul was born March 31st. He grew up in a very ordinary family at that time. His dad was a machinist. He worked with his hands, kind of a blue-collar kind of a guy. He had been an immigrant, his dad and mom, from Sweden. So they were first generations to Canada, or to the U.S., And they loved Jesus. They were active in their church. And this man, Gus, and his wife, Ruth, Paul's parents would end up with 2 sons. Paul, the firstborn, and 5 years later, his younger brother named Dwight. Paul, as a boy, had asthma. I don't know if any of you have asthma or know people who had asthma. But for Paul, what it meant is he didn't get to play and roughhouse as much as some of his friends. And he started to gravitate more and more to reading books and studying. He apparently was quite a bright young guy. And he grew up in the church, loving Jesus and knowing about Jesus. In fact, by the time he was a teenager, around the outbreak of World War II, he led his youth group onto the streets of Los Angeles to invite the servicemen and women who had arrived in Los Angeles as part of the war effort to come to their church on Sundays. He was a really committed guy. 2 things happened when he was a teenager. 2 things that would shape Paul Carlson's life. The first is he went to a Christian camp. I'm not sure if it was exactly like Sunnybrae, but it was a Bible camp. And while he was there, he had a counselor who worked in his cabin, and his counselor was in school to become a doctor. And Paul heard this guy's story and thought, when I grow up, I want to be like him. The second thing that also happened when he was a teenager is he went to a talk at his church of a missionary who was visiting, and Paul heard this missionary's story and thought, you know what? I want to be a missionary. And so from a fairly young age, Paul decided he was going to be a missionary doctor. Put those 2 things together. That's what he was going to do with his life. By the time he graduated high school, he'd done really well. He went to the University of California. He only did a semester. He didn't like it at all. He said it was much too large. He just sort of was lost in this huge crowd of people that were there. We can go to slide 5 if Andrew's still able to. I'll show you a picture of Paul here. This is the first one we have of him. Oh, sorry, that's 5. Let's go to 6 as well. 6 is when he's heading off to college. There he is. He had, as I said, he had gone to the University of California to start his science degree that would then lead him to this medical degree. That was his dream. After the first semester, he decided, this is not for me. He dropped out and decided, along with one of his closest friends, to join the Navy. World War II was still happening. This is about 1945. Before they went to the Navy, though, he decided he and his good buddy would take one massive epic road trip. And so they hitchhiked across the United States from California to Michigan. And that would become important. It'll become important a little bit later in his story. He returned to California, joined the Navy, was part of the Navy for 2 years, never saw combat. But again, that's another little piece of his story that later on will become very, very important. Those 2 years he spent as part of the Navy, even though he was never actually at war, but he was there and signed up. Came back from the Navy, he went back to school and decided it's time to get serious, it's time to finish school and become a doctor and become a missionary. And so he looked around for a school that he thought he would want to go to, and he remembered on his trip to Michigan hitchhiking that he really liked it out east. And so he found a school in Chicago and decided that's where he would go. So he moved to Chicago and began going to school. While he was there, at the same time, a young woman from a little town in Michigan also was in Chicago, also had gone to school to become a nurse. Her name was Lois. And Paul and Lois's paths crossed one day when he was working part-time as an orderly in the hospital because he needed to make money to go to school. And he met her and he decided, she's the one. It took him quite a while, apparently, to actually ask her out on a date. And when he finally did, he invited her to go play tennis with him. Lois later told about this story. She said she actually didn't play tennis, didn't like tennis, but she was kind of interested in this guy. And so she agreed to go play tennis with Paul and was ecstatic when the day came and it rained. And instead of tennis, they played ping pong. And a connection was made. That was in the spring, I think, what was the year of 1948. By late fall of 1948, they were getting to know each other. They'd been dating for a while and had already started to talk about the day that they might get married. Now, the trick was that Paul still had 7 years of school. And on top of that, he had decided he wanted to be a missionary, and Lois was not so excited about that. In fact, she started praying that God would not want them to go to the mission field, that God would find her completely unusable as a missionary. That was her prayer. That Christmas, Paul traveled all the way back to California to visit his family for Christmas. He came back at New Year's to be with Lois and a couple of his friends at New Year's Eve. They traveled around that New Year's Eve looking at Christmas lights. I don't know if you've ever done that, driving around your car looking at Christmas lights. He said they got to one really spectacular house, and the friends they were with on this double date got out of their car to go see the lights of this house. And while they were gone out of the car, Paul asked Lois, "Would you marry me?" She agreed, but they decided they would keep it secret because it was a long ways away before they were going to be able to get married. So for the next 6 months, they told no one. They went back to just life as normal. That summer, on July 4th, remember this is the States, July 4th is a big day for our friends down south, they announced their engagement. And they decided that in a year's time, they would get married. You see, Paul now had decided, instead of staying at Chicago University, he was going to go back home to California to keep studying, this time at Stanford. So a full year would go with Lois in Chicago and him in California before finally a wedding happened, September 16th, 1950 in Michigan. They got married. They settled in California. They got really involved in their church. They both loved the Lord and were really excited about being a part of that community. And they were there for a number of years as he finished up his undergraduate type degree, the first step in becoming a doctor. And then when he got finished that, he needed to find a medical school. And the only one he could find, because so many people had come back from the war and were going into school, the only school he could find that would take another student was in Washington, D.C. And so Paul and Lois, they loaded up everything they owned in a small little car and drove across the country. They would often joke that once they got to Washington with no home, everything was filled, there was no vacancies. They applied to live in an apartment where there were 20 other people who had applied before them. And they literally begged the apartment manager to give them the apartment because they said, "We have nowhere to live, we own nothing, and we're supposed to be going to school." He finally showed them some pity and gave them this apartment. And they lived with just the cardboard containers that they had in their car. So they would sit on these boxes. The little kids who were in other apartments would sort of joke and notice that these were the people who had no furniture. That was what they would talk about, these people who didn't even own a table. But that was the early years for Paul and Lois. And they lived there, again, got involved in their church. In fact, Paul not only got involved in his church, he started getting involved in this medical clinic for poor people who were living on the streets. And one night a week, he would go down and he would just volunteer, kind of like a doctor in training for people who wouldn't have been able to afford any sort of medical care. Paul finally graduated in 1956 as a doctor. Him and Lois moved back all the way to California again. He began to intern at a hospital. It was the next step in his training. He had to be part of that. He also picked up a couple other jobs to try to have enough money so that they could live. His parents gave them a little bit of money to buy a house, so they had a down payment. They bought this cute little house, and they thought life was wonderful, especially Lois. Now we were settled down, and her husband had gone to work, and they owned a little house, and she gave birth to their first child, a little boy named Wayne. They would eventually have two, Wayne and then Lynette. And life just settled into this nice, normal routine. Some people actually might call it sort of a version of the American dream, if you've ever heard that expression. And Lois was pretty excited because she thought this dream of being a missionary, God had answered her prayers. They weren't going to have to go. The only downside was that through these last few years, not only did Paul not talk much about missions anymore, he started to talk less and less about God. And it was like he started to fall out of love with Jesus. In fact, he talked about that time later in his life as a couple more years went on, as being kind of one of the deep values of his life. He actually said it for a brief time. He said, I wasn't even sure if I believed in God anymore. Over the next couple years, he continued to do his medical work. As I said, they talked less and less about missions until it was just not even talked about in their home. Until an odd thing happened in 1961. A letter arrived at their house from the Congo Protestant Relief Agency. Something they had never heard of, something they hadn't applied for. And a letter came saying, we would like Paul to come and be a doctor in the Congo for a year. And Paul thought, it's ridiculous. I would never go to the Congo for a year. That would be way too long. But to hear the change in that, Lois did. She said, way too long. You mean he would actually entertain leaving everything to go to the Congo for a shorter time? And she started to get a little worried because that's exactly what Paul had in mind. In fact, he started praying that if that's what God wanted, that there would be a shorter time offered to him. 4 months later, another letter arrived at their house saying, we would like Paul to come, but for 4 months. He started talking to Lois. He said, you know what, I really feel this is what God would want me to do. And she actually said to him, you know what, if that's what you think God wants, then you should write and ask for more information. And when he said nothing more of it, she thought, I guess he's not that interested. Until late in June of that year, 1961, a letter came. She said she actually tried to hide it under a whole bunch of other letters, hoping he wouldn't find it. And she thought the letter was going to be information about the Congo and what they were after, but Paul came home that night from working at the hospital. He opened up the mail, he got to this letter, opened it up, and said to Lois, I'll be leaving on July 18th. And she said, what? And he said, well, you told me if I was interested to send away for more information, and I did. And they wrote back saying that they would like me to come, and so now I leave in 3 weeks. I don't know exactly how that went over in that family, but 3 weeks later, Paul got on a plane and traveled to the Congo, where he would spend the next 4 months. I think we can get on to maybe the next picture. I'm not sure. What number are we on? There we are. The Congo was a very different place than California. As I mentioned, it was pretty rough up in the remote parts, but even in the capital where he first landed when he flew in after July 18th, he went to the main hospital. And what he found there was their main teaching school where they taught all the doctors in the Congo, and there was exactly 3 students. And not only were there only 3 students, there was really only one surgeon who was there basically in the entire country. There was no running hot water. There was no power plant in the hospital. So when the sun went down at night, there was no lights left. They would just use a kerosene lamp, or if they were lucky, a flashlight with batteries to operate. Can you imagine a doctor operating on you at night and holding up a flashlight to see what's going on? That was the situation that Paul encountered when he arrived in the Congo. He was assigned a posting at a little town called Wasolo. It was a village, really. They hadn't had a doctor there for 3 years. Now, a little bit about the Congo so we know what's going on, because why weren't there doctors in the Congo? What had happened that this country was in such a horrible spot? Congo had been a Belgian colony up until about the year 1960. And then in 1960, the Belgian government decided, we'll leave the Congo, let it become its own nation, and we will leave and go home. And what that meant is all the government officials, all the army, and all the doctors and nurses went back to Belgium, leaving virtually no one who knew how to do medical work. In fact, here's the numbers so you can kind of imagine what it's like. In the U.S. at that point, for every 700 people, there was one doctor. In the Congo, for every 100,000 people, there was a doctor. Paul went to Wasolo, and he was the doctor for miles and miles around. In fact, I think the closest doctor to the west was about a 2.5-hour trip. To the south was, I think, something about 3 hours. And to the east, it was completely unknown, even if there was a doctor from that point east. Now remember, this is a time when most people would never even travel more than a few miles from their home. So if you needed a doctor, Paul was going to be it. The trip there was incredibly difficult. The roads had been mostly destroyed, and so they went with canoes, dugout canoes. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. They went through swamps. He arrived on a Sunday of all times, and they, knowing that this was supposed to be the missionary doctor, they announced to the church in this little town that Paul would be coming to preach. Now remember, he only spoke English, and so he used a translator. He delivered this message, and after church, they had a baptism service. They went down to this river that was full of all sorts of creepy things, including crocodiles. And they had a baptism service, and he said their trust in Jesus was so amazing to him that he decided this is where he belonged. Now remember, he's supposed to go home in a few months. So, when his time came up, the 4 months was over, the head of the church there, a man by the name of Joseph Doko, through an interpreter, told Paul that he wanted him to be their doctor. They actually came up with a name for him, Monganga Paul, which means my Dr. Paul. He was their doctor now. But he had to go home. He arrived back home in early December of 1961, and Lois described it as the best Christmas they'd ever had. Paul was home, the kids were there. He didn't even have to go to work right away. It was just this most joyful thing. And she said, the old Paul was back. The Paul who was excited about life and excited about the Lord, he was back. The only thing she didn't fully understand is the reason he was back is because he wasn't intending to stay in the U.S. Finally, they started having these conversations where he said, I think I needed to go back to the Congo. But she said, okay, on one condition, which she thought was a foolproof condition, that they contact you and say all the funding's in place to send you a surgeon doctor to the Congo. She thought it would never happen. A few months later, the letter came. The funding's in place. We would like you to come to the Congo. They announced that they were leaving at a dinner party of their friends. They gathered all their doctor friends together, all these surgeons, and announced that they would be leaving California to go to the Congo. His friends were just dumbfounded. None of them even knew he ever had wanted to be a missionary. He didn't tell them a thing about it. They were incredibly puzzled. In fact, a couple of them got together and they said, you know what, Paul? Look, we're going to offer you the job of a lifetime. You can be the chief surgeon in our medical clinic. So why don't you just stay? I did some math. Do you know that a chief surgeon in a medical clinic like that in Redondo Beach, that's where they live, would have made almost $500,000 US to start? And Paul said, no, I'm going to go to the Congo as a missionary. They said, well, you must be crazy. You should try it. He said, no, I want to go back to the Congo. They said, look, we'll let you come be a doctor with us for as long as you can. And then if this whole mission thing works out, then you can go. And they thought, for sure, once he started, getting this paycheck and having all this stuff, there's no way he's giving it all up to go to the Congo. And so they said, even if you only stay a month, just come and be a doctor. So he started operating with them, had this fairly prestigious position. But sure enough, a few months later, all the tickets were in place. Paul left the American dream behind to go to the Congo. Now, he didn't get to go right there. First, he had to go to England, and he learned about tropical medicine, because the medicine that he was going to run into in the Congo was very different than what surgeries were going to be in Redondo Beach, California. Then he went to Paris with his family to learn French, because in the Congo, one of the main languages at that point was French. And then finally, they got on a plane. They flew to Leopoldville, which is one of the bigger cities in the Congo. From there, they traveled by truck through these windy roads, over these treacherous bridges. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures of these bridges, so we can go to the next couple. That actually is a bridge. That's not a bridge being built. That's not a bridge that needs repairs. That's it. In fact, when they would drive over them, half the people would get out, so that if something happened, there would be people who could kind of rescue the rest who went over the edge. There's another bridge. It's a little bit upgraded. That's the kind of roads they had to go on. And you see in the left-hand corner there, that's one of the canoes that they would use. You see, you couldn't take a road all the way to Wasolo. There weren't roads that would get you there. At some point, all their stuff, all their possessions, and their kids and everything got loaded up in those little dugout canoes, and they went up the river to Wasolo. And I think we've got a short video. It's not the actual bridge they went over, but it's a good example of the kind of stuff that they encountered. We'll see if we can get it for you there. It's a real short one. It's only like 20 seconds long. Or not. There you go. Imagine if that was your commute. That's the equivalent of the Highway 97 outside of Wasolo. Well, not even outside of Wasolo. That's actually outside of one of the bigger centers. By the time you get to Wasolo, you're not probably going to find much of a road there. They arrived in this little village. They just started learning language. You see, turns out the people in Wasolo, not many of them spoke French, because they were in a smaller town, little village. They spoke Lingala, and Lingala apparently is a very difficult language to learn because some of the words are actually spelt the same and are almost pronounced the same, but they use tonal inflections. So sometimes the word would go up, and sometimes the word would go down. And you would spell it the same, pronounce it the same, but just the different in inflection could mean the difference between to know something or to steal something, or to speak or a peanut. And these people arrived from the U.S. not knowing any of this. And Paul had to learn all these terms because he was going to be working in this little hospital there in Wasolo. And his wife, Lois, had to learn all these terms because she was going to be a nurse in the hospital. And also she was going to run the radio transmitters that were part of their work there. Now, we'll have to move along here fairly quickly because we only have an hour. And there's so much to tell on this fantastic adventure they were on. Let me tell you about some of the things they ran into in Wasolo when he started doing his medical work. The first thing that was different than over here in Canada is here, if you go to the hospital, chances are you have a room with maybe like a curtain around you, or sometimes you get a room all by yourself and it's kind of private and there's like a door and people have to knock. And if you go in for surgery, I guarantee not everyone can just go in, right? That's not how it works. In Wasolo, it's a totally different experience. Everyone was fascinated by surgery and by the doctors, and there was no privacy because there was almost no walls. And so if someone was in surgery, this was a major community event. Everyone would gather in the room. In fact, it would get so crowded that sometimes Paul said, I could hardly move. We could hardly actually do the surgery because all the family and all the friends would have gathered around. People would camp outside the hospital to see what was going on. They tried to start building some walls to kind of have a little bit of sanitation and privacy, but people didn't stop because this was just part of how they did things over there. He said the very first morning when they arrived in town, they woke up at 6 in the morning. And being on the equator, it turns out they were going to wake up at 6 every morning because of all the roosters outside. They just were kind of all over the place. And not only were there roosters outside, but there was sort of thatched type roofs. And so things would fall from the roof. Imagine, they talked about stories of being at dinner and lizards would fall and like bugs would fall from the roof on them. And when rain came, you couldn't always keep the rain out. And this was life in Wasolo that Paul and Lois brought their two kids, who are at that point 9 and 7, to live in this little village. But Paul would not have traded it for the world. He felt that this was what God had called him to do. Now, they lived on the top of a big hill in this town of Wasolo. The reason they lived up on the top of the hill is because the only connection to the outside world was a radio transmitter that didn't work very often. And the only way to power the radio transmitter was a generator because there was no power that came into this town. So they would, once a day, fire up the generator for a bit so they could turn on the radio, And each of the different mission stations in that part of the Congo would report throughout the day. I think if we go to picture, where are we? Are we 11 and 12, somewhere around there, Andrew? You'll see kind of a little bit of what life was like in Wasolo. They would get up at 6. They would have kind of their morning devotions as a family, eat something. Paul would start work at 7:30 every morning. Now remember, he was the only doctor for miles around, and people, he talked about the fact that people in Wasolo didn't keep track of time the way we do. They didn't have watches, they didn't own calendars, and so if they knew they were going to need medical care, they would just travel all the miles and just live outside the hospital for a few weeks. The only time of year that didn't happen was harvest time, when it didn't matter sort of what was going on. You didn't leave your food and your crops because you needed that food. Now, Paul realized that he was going to be seeing so many people that if he didn't have some way of kind of managing this, he would be working nonstop. As it was, he saw about 200 patients a day. That was his regular routine. He was the only doctor in a hospital of 80 beds. And so he came up with this plan. The plan was that for any patient to see him, they first had to see one of the nurses. And the nurse would decide if it was serious enough that it needed the doctor, the surgeon. One day, he had worked all night long doing an emergency surgery. He'd gotten up got a little bit of sleep at the end of that night, got up in the morning, had breakfast, went and did 3 more surgeries, did his rounds, came home at lunch, and Lois said he was so exhausted he just fell asleep. And she decided he desperately needs rest. So when the frantic guy on the bike came riding up to the house, she said, "Have you seen the nurse first?" He said, "No, I've just come." She didn't understand all what he was saying. She knew something was going on. He needed the doctor. So she sent him back to the hospital. And the hospital was a little bit of a ride away. So he frantically pedaled his bike to the hospital, told the nurse what was going on, frantically pedaled his bike back up. You see, what had happened that day was that a few men had been hunting out in the jungle. And one of the men had been trying to catch a large wild pig that had these huge tusks. And as he tried to hunt it, the pig got him instead of the opposite. And he was all cut and damaged badly. And his friends didn't know what to do. So you know what they did? They took giant banana leaves. And they wrapped them up in leaves, like his whole body, and they just tied ropes around him and carried him for hours to get to the doctor. Lois didn't know what the emergency was, so when the guy on the bike arrived, he was one of the friends saying, "Our friend desperately needs the doctor." She felt terrible afterwards, having sent him away. But that was sort of what life was like for these people in Wasolo. We can go on to picture 13 and 14. I'm not sure where we are there. They tell another story of Christmas Eve. A Christmas Eve in Wasolo, they had a few certain special foods that they couldn't get very often. In fact, when they moved all their stuff from the United States, they moved a whole bunch of food with them in barrels. Unfortunately, when they opened the barrels a few months later, thinking they were going to have all this food, it was full of bugs. They learned that you can't actually preserve food in Wasolo in barrels. You have to do other things. So Christmas came and they had special foods. They had found crab salad, grapefruit, carrot pudding. They had meatballs and a few potatoes, just a few. Not lots, but a few that they were going to get a taste of potato out there in the jungle. But first, before they could have dinner, Paul had one last thing he had to do that night. He had to do an autopsy. That's when someone's died and they're trying to figure out what's going on. But now remember, we're in the jungle. There's no power. There's no way to do much. So what they did there to get ready for that is they would just bury the person. And then when they were ready to do the autopsy, they would kind of unbury them. And so 2 days after this poor person had died, they unburied the person so Paul could do an autopsy on Christmas Eve. That's just sort of what life was like in Wasolo. They actually, by the time the autopsy was done that night, a group of Catholic nuns from nearby had brought another person to the hospital who desperately needed surgery, or this person was going to die. And so Paul operated all through that night, not with lights like we have. He used a little kerosene lantern. Someone would hold the lantern so that he could see what he was doing. He operated all that night, and by the time surgery was done, it was Christmas. Can you imagine if that was your Christmas Eve routine? This brings us to our next really important part. We're up to maybe 13 or 14. That Christmas, let me just make sure I'm getting things in the right order here. A young guest medical student from Baltimore arrived in Wasolo. He had gotten a grant from Smith, Klein, and French, a fellowship, part of what his education had been involved in. So he was going to have his way paid to the Congo to help Paul at this little hospital. His name was Philip Littleford. What Paul didn't know is that part of what Smith and Klein were going to do is they were also going to send a photographer from Time Life to take all sorts of pictures of this and show what life was like in this little village. That's going to be important in a few minutes, but just kind of keep that little piece in mind. And so the photographer arrived. They took all sorts of pictures. They showed what life was like in Wasolo. And the Time Life photographer actually got really fascinated, not just with Philip, this young doctor student, but with Paul, this man who had given up a career as a surgeon in Redondo Beach, California, to go to a little village in the Congo. It made no sense. So he took all sorts of pictures of Paul Carlson and his life there in the Congo. And that edition of Time Life would come out just a few months later in our story. Over the next while, Paul would operate and do countless treatments on people. Typically, there was birthing complications, so that was very, very often the case, as women would have trouble in birthing, and then they would have to, be carried for sometimes days to get to this hospital where he would be able to try to save them and the babies. Lots of cases of measles and mumps. The other big thing is just outside of Wasolo was a huge leper colony. So that's kind of foreign for us. We don't have that issue. But there was a huge community just outside, and he did all the medical care for all the people in this leper colony. And he took care of literally about 100,000 people in this area of the Congo. Now, remember when I told you that the Belgian government had left in about 1960 from the Congo? That's why there weren't many doctors. Well, when the Belgians went, not only did they take the doctors, but they also took the government and they took their soldiers with them. And it left the Congo in a very, very difficult spot. No one knew who was supposed to rule. They'd had elections, but not everyone was excited about those elections. And by 1964, there was a group of people who got together who decided they wanted to rule the country. They called themselves the Simbas. Now, anyone know what a Simba is? I bet you when I tell you, you will know. Because there's a movie that I think has this. Simba is a lion. Isn't that the name of a lion in some movie? See? I knew you knew. I knew it. They called themselves the Simbas. They thought of themselves like lions. And the leader of the Simbas was a military general who told these soldiers that if they would follow him, he was going to give them all sorts of power and they could have anything they want. And he actually promised them if they followed him, a bullet couldn't kill them. It would just pass right through. They were going to be invincible. All they needed to do was follow him and do what he said. Now, in the spring of 1964, one of the other doctors in the Congo got very sick. And Paul was called on the radio one day and told that he needed to come quickly. And he traveled, actually, it was something like 17 hours from one evening all through the night with different jeeps and trucks. And he would go from one mission station to the next. And then he would park that truck and grab another truck that was all fueled up. And he drove 17 hours straight to get there to save this man's life. He was able to save his life, but they realized this other doctor wasn't going to be able to stay in the Congo. He was going to have to go back to the States. And so Paul helped him travel all the way back to the capital city. And when he got to the capital city, he started to hear about these Simbas, about these rebels. And he thought, this doesn't sound very good. This sounds dangerous, but they're so far from Wasolo. They'll never come. Why would they ever come to the village at the end of the world? So he went back to his little village and started again being a doctor. Summer of 1964 was very exciting. We should be up to maybe about picture 20 by now. Sorry, I've not done a good job, Andrew, of keeping track for you. But in the summer of 1964, some very exciting news came over the radio one day. Flossie, I haven't told you about her. She was the pastor's daughter of this little village. They had a little church, and the pastor's daughter, Flossie, she was the midwife. She helped the women who were going to have kids. She worked alongside Paul in the hospital. She was apparently a wonderful young gal, and she had fallen in love with another guy whose name was Paul, not to be confused with the Dr. Paul, but Paul, a local guy in another village nearby who had gone away to school in Belgium. He was apparently very bright, came up through a mission school, was trained, and then they helped him go to university in Belgium. And Flossie and Paul had written letters back and forth. They had fallen in love, and they decided one day they were going to get married. It was going to be very exciting. And all of a sudden, in the summer of 1964, one day when the radio came on and the little transmission thing, and they wouldn't use many words because they didn't have much time, a message came through. Paul Sadua was coming to Wasolo, and he planned to marry Flossie. The only problem was they didn't get the message until 3 weeks before the wedding day. He had sent letters, but they did have postal service to Wasolo. It would come once every week or month or 6 months, or sometimes just the letters would never come. And so he had written about his intentions and his plans, but they never got the letter until they got this radio transmission. Can you imagine finding out that you're going to get married in 3 weeks and you live in a little village and there's nothing there to prepare? And so Lois, Paul's wife, started making wedding dresses and making dresses for the flower girls. I think Lynette, her daughter, was going to be one of the flower girls, something like that. They started trying to make a cake with kind of the ingredients they had on hand. They got very excited about this big event in Wasolo where Flossie was going to be married and then she was going to move to Belgium. At the same time, they started hearing even more serious rumblings that the Simbas, these rebels with guns and they were up to no good, had started to spread. It actually got kind of scary. Some of the bigger cities were overthrown by these rebels. But Paul still thought, you know what? We're so far out, there's really no reason they'd ever come out to this place. One day, though, as they turned on the radio to listen to the other stations report in, because every day, every station would report in just to let them know we're okay. They got to one of the stations, and it was just silence. Well, they thought, maybe the power's out. And the next day, when they got to that station again, they listened, and there was silence. And the third day, there was silence. And they began to realize something's going on. But they really didn't have much. They couldn't send an email. They couldn't make a phone call. They didn't know what was going on in the outside world. But they knew something was going on that wasn't good. Eventually, they heard what had happened. The town of Bumba had fallen. The rebels had taken it. And all of a sudden, Paul realized, Bumba's getting a little closer. That's not this city far, far away anymore. But they still had a wedding to plan, and they didn't want to get distracted from their wedding details. So by the end of August of that year, they were busy planning a wedding and all the festivities as they were listening also to the radio reports of the rebels getting closer and closer and closer. On August 20th at 4 p.m., a broken transmission, that means they could kind of hear it but kind of not, and it came through, and here's what they heard. Get out of there. Do you read us? Yeah, well, we're not sure who they're talking to. They're not talking to us at Wasolo, surely. That must be a message for someone else. And so they continued to stay. August 22nd was going to be the wedding, and they had excitement on their minds. At 2 p.m. on August 22nd, 2 hours before the wedding for Flossie and Paul, the radio report came through. Wasolo, you must immediately evacuate. We can't evacuate 2 hours before the wedding. So they decided they would have the wedding and then they would evacuate. They had a lovely wedding as Flossie and Paul got married, and then it started to rain. Well, they thought, we don't have to evacuate now because when it rains in the Congo, no one goes anywhere. You know those roads we saw? They just turn to mud. They're impassable. You can't drive a vehicle. You can't even really walk on them. And so they thought, you know what? We'll wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll evacuate. On the 23rd, it was still raining. They thought, well, we can't evacuate now. But they started to pack up their things. On the 24th, it was still raining. Remember, they're living near the equator in a jungle. But the radio report that day was that things maybe were a little bit better. And so they thought, maybe we'll get to stay. Maybe it's not going to get as bad as what we thought. And for the next few days, it continued to rain, and they weren't sure what to do. September 4th came, though, and to sort of speed up our story, it was finally decided that this would be the day that Paul would take his wife and kids, and they would go across the Ubangi River into the Central African Republic. In other words, the next country over. And they lived very close to the border. If you remember that picture I showed of Congo, they lived lived right up at the top. They were less than 10 miles from the border. And so that day, Paul took his wife and his kids. They went across the river, and he set them up in a little abandoned house that had been there. And he decided, I'll go back to Wasolo. I'll keep working in the hospital. I'll come back on Sunday and check on them. And then the following Wednesday, I'll evacuate. I'll stay as long as I can because there's people who need me. So he went back, continued to work. On Sunday, he traveled across the river in one of those little dugout canoes. Everything was fine. His wife and kids were fine. He was fine. And he went home back to Wasolo. On Monday, he transmitted from the radio station to Lois and the kids, who could only hear him now. They only had a radio where they could hear. They couldn't send messages from this new little house. They were told everything is fine. Tuesday, everything is fine. On Wednesday, hundreds and then thousands of people from the Congo started crossing the river. And Lois knew not everything's fine. But she had no way of telling Paul. He was there in Wasolo. In fact, on Wednesday, he sent a message to Lois basically saying, there's something's going on, but I think everything's going to be fine. There was no one to send a message to him. No one was willing to cross back the river to get word to Paul. It turned out what had happened, they found out afterwards, is that the rebels decided, we can't use trucks, we'll use canoes. And they came right up the river. Instead of going up the road where Paul thought he would hear them coming and be able to escape, they came up the river and actually cut off his escape route. And he was stuck in Wasolo. A couple days later, Paul came back on the radio. And some people heard him. And here's what they said on the radio. They said, Dr. Paul, where are you? Everyone has gone. You're the only one remaining. Where are you? You see, they thought he had somehow escaped Wasolo, that surely he hadn't stayed there because the rebels were all there now. Here's his message back. I'm sorry. I misjudged the situation. I'm still here. He had been hiding in the jungle, and for a few minutes every day, he would run to his house, start the generator, and as soon as the generator started, it was noisy, so he was worried the rebels would hear, and he would just send these short little messages, I'm still okay, and then he would run back into the jungle and he would hide. He would also try to get to the hospital to take care of the patients, but he was trying to do it so that the rebels would never notice he was there. On September 18th, he sent another message on the radio saying, I'm okay still. It was the last message that he would get to send out. A few days later, word came that the rebels had captured Dr. Paul. And over the next few days, all sorts of weird messages started coming out. Some reported that he was working at another hospital, that the rebels had taken him to a bigger city. Others had said he'd been set free. Lois and the kids didn't have a clue what was going on. They later found out from two missionaries who went back to Wasolo to find out what had happened, that one of the former nurses who had been fired from his job before Paul and Lois had ever gotten to the town, but he was angry about that. He went to the rebels and he said, I know that in Wasolo they have a phone, meaning a radio, not a telephone. The rebels thought, well, he must be a spy if he has a phone. And so they went and they arrested Dr. Paul, and they took him with guns and all that kind of stuff with a few other people, and they locked him up in a prison. He was kept there for a month in this prison. While he was there, he took care of the other prisoners. He was still being a doctor. He had taken his little New Testament with him, so he was able to read his Bible every day. And on September 25th, he actually managed to smuggle out a letter. Here's what he wrote. I have to go to Stanleyville. I don't know the future. I don't expect you to see you again in this life. I'm sorry, honey. I did this to you. I did not realize. I trust in God. There must be a reason for all of this. Tell everyone to labor harder for Christ for me. I love you very much, and one of the hardest things has been causing you so much suffering. Make a family, and if God gives you someone else to take my place, let it be so. I'd rejoice for you. Tell everyone at our mission station we must follow Christ. Then he added a letter to his parents. He said, Mom and Dad, you gave me to God. Leave me there. I'm confident of his direction. For me to live as Christ and to die as gain. This has become more real each day. I walk and rest alone with God. All my love till I see you here or above. Paul. You go to picture 21, I think, Andrew. Now remember the Time Life photographer who had come with the medical student, Phil? Unfortunately, when the Time Life photographer had come and taken all those pictures, he also told part of Paul's story. The part about how he had joined the Navy a long time ago, he was just a kid. But the rebels got a hold of the Time Life magazine. and found out that he had been a part of the U.S. Navy and decided that Paul was a spy. And they actually started calling him Major Carlson. They announced to the world that they had captured a U.S. major and that they were going to put him on trial. And they were going to probably shoot him because they decided he was a spy. He was not a good man. They didn't realize that he was loved by all the people that he had cared for. And so, over the next number of weeks, there was trials and rumors of more trials. And they would bring him out and say, now we're going to put you on trial, and this is the end. And then they would say, no, we changed our mind, and they would lock him up again. The whole time they were trying to negotiate with the U.S. government over different things that they wanted and things that they thought they could get. You can go to slide 23 and 24. That's Paul in the left there. This is actually an interesting picture. This is November 18th. When he's brought out to the town square. And there's him and a few of the others who have been captured. He's the one that looks worried in the picture. You know why? It's because he's the only one of the hostages that speaks Lingala. He's the only one that realized at this precise moment that the rebels had said, we're going to kill all the missionaries. The other guys didn't really know what was going on, but Paul realized that their lives were coming to an end. You see, what had happened is, in a strange, really weird twist in the story, the rebels didn't speak much French. They couldn't tell the difference between missionary and mercenary. And so when they kept saying, we're missionaries, they thought they were saying they were soldiers, that they were, coming there to fight against them. So they decided that they shouldn't be allowed to live. They were kept in a hotel. We can go to picture 25. I'm not sure. With this flight of stairs. This would be the flight of stairs that Paul and his friends almost escaped from. You see, on November 24th, the government of Belgium finally decided, we have too many of our people kept there as prisoners. We're going to send in 1,000 paratroopers and we're going to save them. Enough of this negotiating and all these kind of things. And so on November 24th, Paul and the other prisoners heard planes flying overhead. There's actually a video of this on YouTube, the actual paratrooper attack over Stanleyville. And they decided, now's our chance. They ran down the stairs, they got out into the city square, and the rebels panicked. They started shooting at the planes and shooting at the paratroopers, and then they started shooting at these poor, unarmed prisoners. Most of them made it over a wall. There was a wall that they could kind of get over to safety, but Paul wouldn't take his turn. He helped a few of the others. He helped one last man who was struggling, and by the time it would have been his turn, it was too late. And Paul was shot, and he died there in the city of Stanleyville on November 24th, 1964. Now, you would think that's the end of the story, but it's not quite. You see, Lois had a decision to make. The U.S. State Department, this is kind of getting technical for a minute, they told her that they would pay to have Paul's body taken back to the U.S. He was a U.S. citizen, for a proper funeral and a burial. And she decided that Paul would stay in the Congo. And they didn't know quite what to do with it. The whole country was at war. How could we have a funeral? The U.S. Embassy said, you know what? We won't stop you, but we can't really help you. And so 2 weeks after Paul was killed, they planned a funeral back in Wasolo. I think we can get maybe picture 27. Oh, that's him on the cover of Life. Next one, maybe. Let's go 20. Oh, this, I won't read it, but that's the message on the day he was killed from President Lyndon Johnson to Paul's parents. This is the one. This is Paul's funeral service. They brought his body back near Wasolo, and they decided he would be buried there. Lois didn't understand all what this would mean. She didn't understand that for the Congolese people, there is a strong tradition that you are buried in your village. For them, you don't leave home, and then when you die, you come back to your village. And all of a sudden, when Lois made the decision that rather than Paul going back to the U.S., he would stay in Wasolo in the Congo, they realized for the first time that Paul wasn't just a missionary. See, they thought Paul was doing this somehow to become famous, and when the photographers showed up, they thought, well, this must be why he's doing it. He's an American, and he's just trying to become famous. And all of a sudden, they realized that's not what's going on. Paul loved us. In fact, one of them said, Dr. Paul came, he lived among us, and he died among us. just like Jesus, who he's told us about, who came, lived among us, and died among us. And it was actually after his death that many people came to trust Jesus because they realized that what he had been telling them, he really believed, and it was true. Now, again, the story is not quite over. In the middle of the funeral, I don't know if we have a picture of it. Maybe I don't. Maybe 28, 29? Okay. In the middle of the funeral, the army arrived. And everyone thought, now they're going to take us all as hostages. What they didn't realize is the army arrived to pay Paul Carlson tribute. One man actually said of Paul Carlson, "This is the one real man that I've ever met in my life," because he was so courageous and so at peace, even through such incredibly hard things. On his grave marker is John 15:13. "No greater love has a man than this, than a man who lays down his life for his friends." And that little community was transformed, not just through his life and through his medical care, but through his death and what they came to understand that to mean. Here's what his wife wrote a couple years after. "Some would say that it was by chance that Philip Littleford, a medical student of Smith, Kline, and French, came to Wasolo, and that by chance a photographer was sent to shoot approximately 1,000 pictures for an article to appear in a large American magazine about a forgotten corner of the Ubangi where no one ever comes, so that many knew before the rebel propaganda of Radio Stanleyville began that Dr. Paul Carlson existed, and that by chance he was a symbol of all the hostages in Congo, and that by chance, just a moment before he would have been safe, he was felled by a bullet of a young rebel who had no idea who he was. No, it was not by chance. God could have gotten him safely over the wall, just as he had many times before kept Paul safe. I am convinced that God chose to take Paul at that moment to be with him. Our days may be short or long. This fact is brought vividly before me by Paul's death, and each day as I read a daily newspaper, so many people ask me, why were Paul's days cut so short when doctors are so desperately needed? God knows how much Paul was needed as a doctor, but he found he had need of Paul at a particular time and place for his purposes, and I have peace in that assurance. Today in the Congo, through Paul's work and the other missionaries who were there with him, they estimate there are 250,000 church members, 1,600 pastoral workers, 1,700 churches planted, 108 medical clinics, 80,000 students in schools, and 5 hospitals, one named the Paul Carlson Memorial Hospital in Wasolo. Others have called it a senseless tragedy. We can go to, I think, 31 for a second. Oh, there's the park in California named after Paul Carlson, along with a part of the Chicago hospital. On November 17th, when he was a prisoner, he made these notations in his Bible, speaking of his desire not so much to be safe, but to trust in Christ and be able to proclaim the gospel. In fact, on November 23rd and November 24th, every day he made a little notation in his Bible. The 2 days leading up to his death, the only notation were peace, peace. The other prisoners actually commented on it, just so perplexed by this man who was at complete peace, knowing that his end on earth was about to come. Today, let's jump to number 32, 33, 34. The Paul Carlson Partnership exists. It's been going on for 50 years in the Congo. You can go online and see lots of things about it. They mainly set up medical clinics and hospitals. They also now are setting up schools. Their newest project is setting up coffee plantations so that people can actually have jobs. And along with that, ironically, they're building bridges, literally building bridges, so that the farmers can get their crops out and people can get safely to the hospital. These are some of the kids at one of the projects that are being helped and educated. And then just one last picture, 35. This one right here. This is Reverend Mube, who is the son of the young boy who was the Carlson's homeboy, like basically help. They had a hired help who would get them water and get the stove going. And this young boy had been there, watched the Carlsons live. He ended up with a son who knew of Paul Carlson, who came to be so in love with Jesus because of the stories he heard about Paul Carlson that he himself eventually became a pastor in one of these local churches. And then just the last little tidbit that I think is pretty fascinating. Wayne Carlson, the little 9-year-old boy who went to a solo, he came home to the United States with his mom and his sister. He became a doctor, just like his dad. Had a very successful and long career and then retired so that he could go back to a solo because they needed a doctor. And that is the story of Paul Carlson. Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed your ice cream.